I'm probably one of the most blessed persons you'll ever meet in life. And the reason I say that is because I found out that the Lord is willing to use people no matter what your skill sets may be. And when you heard of my bio that was presented, you should have readily caught that I am a recovering attorney. I'm in a 12-step process, moving away from that lifestyle, and have now found myself doing work for the North American division. But the reason that I say that I'm a blessed individual is because I realize that God blesses us in spite of us, in spite of what you think you may bring to the table. And one of the things that I did not ever think would ever happen in my lifetime is that Orlan Johnson would ever be working for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was not on my bucket list. It was not something that I had planned. My mother was actually a church employee in the field of education for about 40 years, and I grew up in a household where my father and I thought it was funny that my mother worked for the church, but none of us were supposed to. So you can imagine the fun my mother had when I called her and I said, Mom, I'm thinking about working for the church. And she started giggling and laughing, and I have to either give the credit or the blame to your union president, Mr. Ken Denslow, who interviewed me and told me all these interesting things. And the most interesting question I asked him, I said, well, Ken, who is in the position that I'm going to take over? And he said, oh man, that hasn't been filled for 13 years. And I was like, it hadn't been filled for 13 years? He said, yeah, it hasn't been filled for 13 years. So I'm thinking to myself, I've never worked for the church before. I'm getting ready to take on a position that hasn't been filled for 13 years. The idea of public affairs and religious liberty was also confusing because I'd only heard about religious liberty. So when I got there, I see that there's this public affairs, this religious liberty, hadn't been there for 13 years. Thank God Melissa was there, right? Because if Melissa wasn't there, I'm not sure how we would put this thing all together. And I will also have to say it's just a joy to work with our team. You guys heard from Bettina earlier today as the editor of Liberty Magazine. And, I affectionately just call them the Women of Pearl. And I enjoy working with the Women of Pearl, and we have a great team that we work together. But what I wanted to tell you today, and one of the first things that hit me when I started on the job is there must have been a reason why the framers decided to call this public affairs and religious liberty. And when you stop and think about it, and I kind of entitled this, that if you do public affairs in an effective way, religious liberty actually becomes easier to do. In other words, public affairs is how you go out and introduce yourself to a community. And once the community knows who you are, then they may now be interested in what your doctrines are all about. The worst question in the world that I ever want to have to encounter when I go someplace, and I tell them I'm Orlan Johnson, I'm with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the idea that they may have to ask me, I'm sorry, who are you and where have you been? And when those two questions begin your whole process of trying to go out and do something, that means that there's a hole in the operation that needs to be filled, and it needs to be filled quickly. And the concept of making sure that they know who you are is so important. So what I want to talk a little bit about today is what I call the PA side of the business, or the public affairs side of the business. Because the public affairs side of the business tells them who you are. And the tagline that we try to operate from in the North American division is, we're just simply here to make friends before we need friends. The worst time in the world to look for friends is when you need a friend. The best time in the world to look for friends is when you're okay and everything's all right. And when I say wanting to make friends before we need friends, I also try to tell everybody, I also think what's critical in that whole concept is you have to give first. In other words, your first relationship cannot be an ask. Your first relationship has to be offering a gift. I don't care how big it is. I don't care how small it is. I don't care what type of minutia you think it may be. Establish yourself as a giver. In other words, I want the community or somebody else to know that I'm here to be a part of the community. I'm here to make an impact in whatever way that I can. But I'm not here just simply because I want to get something from you. I'm here because I want us to have a reciprocal relationship. So if now the public affairs side of the business is moving well, then the religious liberty side of the business is how we let the world know who we are as it relates to our religious doctrines. You know, we have a tendency as Adventists, and I love when we talk about ourselves, we always like to tell people what we don't do. Have you noticed that? We don't smoke, we don't eat pork, we don't drink, with the exception of that medicine and the Robitussin, but we don't generally drink, and we don't do this and we don't do that. What I believe is so important is that we as a church have to make sure that we are looking to do what we can so that we are letting them know what we actually do. You know, Americans get very comfortable in our religious freedom in this country because we're like, we've got the Constitution. We've got the amendments that say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, we like to believe that we should be fine because we live in America. But you know, the fact of the matter is all of that sounds so powerful, so definitive. But what is scary is almost every day someone is chiseling away very quietly and sometimes very loudly most of our religious tenets and things that we have grown to be comfortable with. And all I want to make sure that everyone understands is we are not protected in our religious freedom because of the Constitution. We're protected in our religious freedom because of the power of God. You know, I love the fact that we live in a world where the Bible makes it clear that God takes kings up and God takes kings down. In other words, I don't sit around worrying about whether it's going to be Trump or Biden because my Bible tells me that he who the Son sets free is free indeed. And therefore, what my job is to remind the world of how powerful a God is that I serve and to let them know that you too can be a part of this relationship with God. But the idea that we think that there's nothing that we have to worry about is really a fallacy. You know, Pew Research just put out some information the other day, and you probably will be shocked when you hear this, that 80% of the world does not get to serve their God the way they see fit. 80%. And the fact of the matter is, in the type of world that we live in now, where everything is so global, communications move so fast, that the idea that something that may be going on in somebody else's backyard could slowly find itself creeping into my backyard, regardless of what the rules and regulations say. Because we have to be very cautious in understanding that religious freedom is a fragile concept. I think I even heard somebody mention earlier, democracy is a fragile concept. Many people called it an experiment. And the question is that experiment actually continuing to win and to move forward? Some days we don't even know. But I would tell you that we're in a situation where we have to find abilities to work together. Take a look at this slide right here. This is one of the funniest slides. I try to tell people, as Adventists, we live in a world where we sometimes think that we're this huge, big religious organization. We think that the whole world knows who we are because we all kind of know ourselves here in Battle Creek. And we think that this is something that the moment they hear Seventh-day Adventists, everybody will know who we are. Those are the Sabbath keepers, they're vegetarians. Take a look at this number right here. In the North American division, we have what? 1.2 million Adventists, 6 million Jews, 70 million Catholics, 16 million Southern Baptists, 8 million Methodists, 7.5 million Mormons. What's our number again? 1.2 million. When they all get together and pick one day to worship, guess what day they're not going to pick? It's so critical that in whatever we do, that we are building coalitions. In other words, there will come a time where we will need somebody else to be willing to stand up with us. The numbers don't play out for us to do this by ourselves. And that's why, Melissa was talking about sometimes you find yourself in strange partnerships. I like to look at public affairs and religious liberty kind of in the same concept that Henry Kissinger used to operate in. You remember that saying Kissinger had? No permanent enemies, no permanent friends, just permanent interest. We have to operate on the permanent interest of protecting religious freedom at all times. And at all times, that is first and foremost on the list. It's easy to get caught up in, but their doctrinal beliefs are different from my doctrinal beliefs. But if the foundation is we want religious freedom for all, that's critical. And let me tell you something, and you should be very proud of this. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has been doing more work in religious freedom for non-Adventists than maybe any other religious organization in the world. We work to protect everyone. We don't simply look out for ourselves, we look out for everyone. I remember when I first came to the division, we took on a case where we were working with a Muslim young lady who had lost her job at Abercrombie and Fitch because she wore a hijab. And they said that her hijab did not fit their looks policy. And we ended up writing a brief to the Supreme Court as part of her decision. The decision came back unanimous in her favor, and in the final decision, there was a small piece of the Seventh-day Adventist brief that was actually quoted in the decision. The idea that we understand that injustice for one is injustice for all. And the Adventist Church has been out on the forefront fighting for people for probably hundreds of years at this point. We are out making sure that we're looking out for everyone's interests. And therefore, when we have issues, people come to help look out for our interests. These two photos here that I have is actually a prayer breakfast that we do at the North American Division every year. Every year in January, we have a prayer breakfast where we invite individuals from many different denominations. And our breakfast is very simple. We have 6 prayers from 6 different denominations, and we have breakfast. People just come and get together. And you know what the statement is that we hear all the time at this breakfast, Ken? Everyone says, we never get together with other religious groups on a regular basis. We usually only go to meetings among our own sect. And to be at this breakfast where you can sit down at the table with somebody who's Ukrainian Orthodox, who is Jewish, who is Methodist, who is Baptist, and realize that you have more in common than you have that are different. That doesn't mean that we're trying to assimilate or engage in some quote unquote unity of all religions. It just simply means that we are required to love our fellow man the way Christ loved everyone else. I hope I don't cast a shadow on your Sabbath when I say this, but I have to be Christian first and Adventist second. Because if I'm not a good Christian or I'm not a good Adventist, then the two never come together. You cannot be a good Adventist if you're not a good Christian. And being a good Christian means you have to demonstrate love to your fellow man at all times. Too many of us want to be secret agents for Jesus. And he wants you to be a uniformed soldier. Too many of us are trying to figure out how can we find the smallest Bible that we can find, when Lord wants us to be demonstrating who we are. Because with him, we can do things that are more powerful than anything else. Building coalitions, making sure that we're looking to work with others. Melissa talked about some of the work that she does. And to be honest, the work that Melissa does, in my opinion, being our director of government affairs, that is as much a public affairs job as there is. Being down on Capitol Hill, trying to be the face of our church, having to work in conjunction with individuals who sometimes have no idea who we are. But let me tell you one great story. We were working on something there, I think it was called the Respect for Marriage Act, in which Melissa and the team was working to really put some language into this particular piece of legislation that was going to be empowering the LGBTQ plus community. But in terms of protecting the church, it was not quite there. Melissa and a team of individuals worked, and by the grace of God, we got some additional language put in so that we would be in a position where we would be protected. But the irony of it all is after it was all said and done, we got letters sent to the North American Division by some of the senators that thanked us for being involved. They thanked us for raising the issue, because if you don't raise the issue, things will move forward like it's no big deal. The idea that we were engaged in the process allowed a change to take place. And then individuals who may have wanted to make the change, but because had nobody who was pushing for that change, would have had to sit idly by and allow things to happen. We got multiple letters from legislative people thanking the Adventist Church for raising the issue and getting involved. One of the fallacies sometimes about us engaging in public affairs is we think that we are creating an inconvenience. We think we're coming in and getting on their nerves. We think we're coming in and bringing something that's problematic. So we get a little concerned that we don't want to necessarily be in the pushing and shoving a little bit. Now, mind you, I like the pushing and shoving, but that's a whole nother thing. But the idea is that they actually need our voices. They actually require our voices because we are a critical part of the community as well. But building coalitions and doing what God has for us to do is key. I love this story about C.S. Lewis in his book called God in the Dock. And he has this concept that if you have 50 people and you bring them into a building and you tell 25 of them that this is a prison and you tell the other 25 that this is a hotel, the 25 that thinks it's a prison thinks this may be the best prison I've ever been in. But the 25 that thinks it's a hotel thinks this might be the worst hotel I've ever been in. But the fact of the matter is, it's all about perspective. What you come in believing this is all about. And at the end of that story, C.S. Lewis points out that if you are here on this earth thinking that you are preparing to be here forever, this is a pretty sad life that you're going to live. But if you understand that this is preparation for one day seeing Jesus, and you're putting things in place to get there, then guess what? This place ain't that bad at all. Because heaven is our home. Because what we are looking to do is to take it to another place. Don't get caught up in how it looks on earth, because at the end of the day, we're trying to go someplace else. Don't worry yourself about the fact that the politics look like they're really, really nasty, because they are. But we are preparing to go someplace else. One of the biggest things that we work on when we go to see our church members now is just simply to remind them, you know what? This public discourse that we have is a little bit too harsh. We need to tamp that down. We need to be kind to our fellow man. I have a differing point of view from you. That doesn't mean you need to be nasty with me. I look and think differently than you are, even from a political standpoint. That doesn't mean I need to be ostracized and my tires need to be flattened. What this means is that I need to spend more time loving you the way Christ loved me. Christ loves all people from all walks of life, from all sects, no matter who they were. And do you remember there was a time where people would say, well, why is he hanging out with those people? The fact of the matter is that's what God is here for us to do. We don't want them to come visit us at church. Well, why not? If the church is someplace where people get healed, then where are sick people supposed to go? But if they don't look like me, if they don't smell like me, if they don't act like me, my brothers and sisters, public affairs means that we are called to be fishers of men. And guess what? When you fish, it's not clean when you pull it in the boat. You bring it in, allow the Holy Spirit to touch it, and then God will handle the rest. I love the idea that when you look to see what kind of world we live in, John 16:33 makes it clear that you are going to suffer tribulation. You do not get to do God's work and just be skipping down the yellow brick road. Suffering happens. Bad things happen. But don't worry, God has made it clear in the end that he has overcome the world. So even though you find yourself in these events that seem to be concerning, you don't have to worry because God has taken care. I love my line I have at the end. I don't worry, you know why? Because I've been to the back of the book. I know how this story ends. And in the end, guess what? God wins. It doesn't matter what it looks like right now. God wins. You know, we talk a lot about politics, and this is something that the church is not supposed to be involved in. You know, one of the things I found pretty interesting is when you read up through the Great Controversy and you read those words that said there was war in heaven. Do you know what that really meant? There was a governing body fight going on in heaven. Somebody else wanted to be in charge. Somebody else wanted to have the power. You know, my wife is a musician, she's a choir director, and I always tell her, well, you know, Lucifer was the choir director. And the choir director wanted to be the pastor. And when the choir director wants to be the pastor, that's when some of these things happen. And the choir director was so good at what he was doing that 1/3 of the church left with him. Sound like a church y'all been at before? The bottom line is the war is real. And the politics and the power of governance was even at issue, even in heaven. I can't even imagine what it must be like, or what you can say in heaven, Willie, to make somebody who's an angel that sees Jesus every day somehow get tricked into thinking I should go someplace else. And yet we can be on this earth asking, well, why is he following that person? Why is he following that person? If 1/3 of the angels can leave heaven, there's nothing on earth that's off limits. We have to understand that we've been to the back of the book, and no matter what it looks like, God is going to win in the end. I love this quote from Dr. King. He says, human progress is neither automatic or inevitable. You know, I think Dr. Burton was talking earlier today that one of our struggles is we like to be silent. You don't get to be silent in this war. You have to speak up. You have to stand up. Dr. King used to always say it wasn't even the quietness of my enemies or the evil of my enemies. It was the silence of my friends that caused me the most pain. You know what God has for you to do, but yet you want to be quiet. You see injustice happening, but yet you want to be quiet. Public affairs says that you can't do that. You have to be seen. You have to be counted. Because you know why? When the quintessential questions get asked when the Lord comes back again, he's not going to ask you whether or not you were in church every Sabbath. He's not going to ask you whether you're a vegetarian, whether you were vegan. You know, he's not going to ask you what kind of sauce you like. Did you use real butter or non-butter? What he's going to ask is when people were hungry, did you feed them? When people were naked, did you clothe them? In other words, when you saw a need, did you step in and do something about it? I got to tell you this story right here. Many of you may not know who this gentleman is, but he's the governor of Maryland. His name is Wes Moore. And you may have seen him on TV recently. He's been on a lot of national shows because of a collapse of a bridge in Maryland, and we've been going back and forth. But Wes Moore just became governor of Maryland not too long ago. And I was at a meeting where I had a chance to meet him. And when I got done talking with him, he was holding my hand kind of tight. He said, Orlan, you got to do me a favor. I said, what? He said, you have to take me over to Tacoma Park Seventh-day Adventist Church. I said, Tacoma Park Seventh-day Adventist Church? He said, yes, you got to take me there. And I said, well, Governor, I'm pretty sure I can bring the church to you. But he said, no, I need to go there. And then he tells me this story. Oh my goodness, Dr. Nelson, you're not going to believe this. He tells me a story that when he was 3 years old, he and his family lived not too far away from the church, and his father died. The day after his father died, a church members come to start visiting his family. They're bringing food, they're bringing money, they're bringing resources, they're babysitting. They are literally taking care of his family the day afterwards. 6 months after doing that, his family from New York come and get him and take him and his family to New York. He lives in New York most of his life. He goes to Valley Forge, a military academy. He goes to Johns Hopkins for college. He goes back to New York. He's working. He decides one day he wants to run for governor of Maryland back in the state where he was born. He comes back to Maryland. He wins the election to become governor. And now he says to me, Orlan, it's been 41 years and I haven't had a chance to tell them thank you. 41 years later, last June, July 22nd, we went to the Tacoma Park Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he told that church that you have no idea what you did for my life. He says, as a 3-year-old, you were the first group that came in and told my mother that she was going to be okay. You were the first group that came in and you did not ask what church we were a member of. The quote I believe that he had in church that day is that you saw a need and you stepped in. You saw pain and you came and made it better. And he told the church on that day, and for that, I will be eternally grateful. You have my heart, you have my mind, you have my soul, and you have my love. This is what's called being Public Affairs Incorporated. Making sure that you are looking out for people without nothing in return. So now all of a sudden, the 63rd governor of the state of Maryland has a special relationship with the Tacoma Park Seventh-day Adventist Church because of something that happened in his life when he was 3 years old. My brothers and sisters, you got to bottle that story and almost take it everywhere you go. You can't even make something like this up. Do you know we went back to Tacoma Park Church, Vilo, there were 2 individuals who were still there that was part of the team that used to visit his family. The idea that God can step in and make a difference in people's lives. Why do I tell you this story? Because you have no idea what you do and when the impact will manifest itself. And some of us like the idea of knowing that we do it and we see the results immediately. 41 years later, the result came back. But my brothers and sisters, that's what God requires of us. to go out without an expectation, to love and to make a difference. That's what public affairs is all about. When I take a look at what we look at from a Bible standpoint, we have to believe that although we know that the end is coming, we have a responsibility to tarry while we are there. You know, I heard Dr. Burton talking earlier today, and I thought to myself, these people thought the world was coming to an end, but they were still running full speed through the tape. No slowing down. No taking time to figure out what else I should be doing with my life. No trying to figure out if there are ways I should be thinking about things in the afterlife. No, keep tarrying and running while you are there. I understand how this ends. I love America as much as anybody. You know, when I heard Dr. Nelson talking about it earlier today, the fact of the matter is I am a dude who gets choked up when I hear the national anthem. When I hear someone singing God Bless America and they hit that inflection, it makes me feel good. But I'm not confused that this same country that I love will one day turn around and snatch all of the power that I think that I might have as it relates to my religious freedom. If not, prophecy will not be fulfilled. So therefore, my job is not to create a mechanism in which we stop things from happening. My job is to create a mechanism so we can make sure that we have a chance to one day see Jesus. I remember when we had Ben Carson was running for president a couple of years ago, and this is one of the things that we do in public affairs is we make sure that when somebody talks about the Adventist church, that the truth gets back out there as fast as possible. Dr. Carson was out, and Donald Trump came out one day, and he said, hey, I'm a Presbyterian. You know, that's kind of down the middle. In all fairness, I mean, but Seventh-day Adventists, I don't know about that. I just don't know. All of a sudden, we started getting phone calls at the North American division from places that we'd never gotten phone calls from before. We ended up having to send Alex Bryant down to meet with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press because they wanted to talk about Adventists. We found ourselves on the Glenn Beck show trying to answer questions about Adventism and what we are all about. Because on one hand, we think that people know, but on the other hand, we think that if we don't tell them, guess what? They make up stuff themselves. So what we ended up doing was we started saying, you know what, this is kind of crazy and it's problematic, but guess what? We even have an opportunity here. So now what we started to do, and Ken was there at the time, we started creating dialogue so anybody who wanted to find out about Adventism, we actually had a quick site they could go to and find out everything about us. We wanted to get the information to them quickly. We started crafting language for the media. We wanted to make sure that when the media comes looking, we give them exactly what we want. How do we learn about this? We actually went down and met with the PR people that work with the Mormon Church. And we went down there, we said, you know, with all due respect, how did you guys have Mitt Romney running for president and none of that crazy Mormon stuff was in the press all the time? And all of us look at each other and we're like, crazy Mormons. There's nothing crazy in the Adventist church. You know, when he was running, I got a phone call from one individual who said, are you guys the religion who have the prophet that got hit with the rock in the head and you follow her? Wasn't exactly how I would have crafted it, right? But if you don't share your own story the right way, it can be twisted and turned in ways that you may never be able to come back from it. Tell your story, tell it fast, tell it clear. Look out at all times. You know, when this was going on, we would watch presidential debates at the NAD with a team of us sitting in a room waiting to see if one phrase was made that sounded like it was a little bit off. So that the moment something would have gone wrong, we would have been immediately able to get it out there and clear it up. That's part of the job of public affairs. That's the job that people don't know about. That's the job that we don't really talk about. Being behind the scenes, making sure that we're all in a position where we're taking, hopefully, God's will and doing what needs to be done with it. One of the things that's really suffering in church, and sometimes I go places and I get invited and people will say to me, well, Orlan, we'd like for you to come out and speak. And just so you know, this is a red church. Or just so you know, this is a blue church. Or just so you know, this is a purple church. And I usually tell them, well, just so you know, I think this is God's church. And I've never crafted a different sermon for a red church or a blue church or a purple church. You know why? Because churches have now become a microcosm of society. We walk into church now and you got to be careful what you do, to mask or not to mask. You know, to be this or not to be that. My brothers and sisters, we can all have different points of view, but God expects us to be a God of love at all times. He expects us to respect our fellow man regardless of our beliefs. All I want our brothers and sisters to do is understand that we all come with flaws. We all come with issues. But it's important that we understand that God is still in control. My only job is we want to stay in the mix, make sure people know who we are, stay in a position where we're protecting ourselves. One of my favorite sayings, and I tell the team this all the time, that we work hard because we need to be sitting at the table, because if you're not sitting at the table, you find yourself on the menu. And when you find yourself on the menu, it's too late at that point. The job is to get off the menu and have a seat at the table, because the people at the table determine what's on the menu. And that's why it's so important that we understand how we do what we need to do. We have some pastors sometimes, they just like to do what they feel like doing. You try to let them know, well, no, we shouldn't do this, we should do that. But you know, the bottom line is that on the ground level, the pastors are really kind of in charge. But we also want people to understand that there are limits as to how far we can go. Partisan politics is a problem. We cannot be a church deciding that we want to let people know what our personal political beliefs are. I do a television show, and matter of fact, Sunday night show is going to have what I call the Women of Pearl: Bettina, Melissa, Jennifer, and Carmela. And we have a show, and we call it Faith in Politics. And Michael was talking about it yesterday. And the tagline on the show is, your faith shaping your politics, or are your politics shaping your faith? In other words, what are you allowing to determine who you are and what you're about? And what we want to make sure that people understand is that what goes on in church should have nothing to do with your partisan personal politics. Now, it's not a problem that you believe what you believe, whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, whether you're more conservative or less conservative. I think it should all be a part of, the spectrum of life. My first job that I ever had in politics, believe it or not, was when I worked at Andrews University. I was a student there for 3 years, and I worked for the congressman in the 4th District of Michigan. When I first got there, it was David Stockman, then it became Mark Siljander. And every year for 3 years, every Friday, I used to go to that office and work in constituent services. It's the first time I learned anything about what went on in politics. And at a later point in time, I worked for Democrats. You heard that I was appointed by President Obama, where I was the chairman of CIPIC. Let me tell you one thing. I've worked for Republicans and I've worked for Democrats, and the one thing I found out is the most important thing for all of them is to get reelected. Some of us think that they're all sitting there fighting about this, fighting about that. My policy is this, my thing is this, my thing is this. It's about reelection. And at the end of the day, sometimes they'll say and do whatever they need to do to get reelected. I've seen it on both sides. Policies and concepts, yeah, that sounds good in theory, but let that concept get in the way of you getting reelected and see what they're going to do. Just my own personal experiences here. But it's so important that we as a church remember that our job is to do God's business. It is not to be involved in politics. Our job is not to be coming to church to tell people who they should vote for. Now, our job should be informing people that you do have a right to vote, letting people know that you should go out and engage in the process. Staying silent actually is a vote. So the reality is we should engage, we should get involved. Our church members should get involved. When I hear people talk about there should be a separation of church and state, absolutely that would be the case, but you can't take the politics out of people, because it's part of what goes on here. When you read in the Bible and you start hearing about in the time of King Uzziah, what is that doing? All it's doing is pointing to a political time in life to let you know what the culture is at that point. It is not a separation of what's going on politically. The Bible is nothing but politics. Kings going after kings. Israel decided they wanted their own king. All of this is part of life. The key is not coming in and getting involved in partisan politics from a church perspective, but engaging in the principles of what we needed to be engaged in, absolutely. When I heard Dr. Burton talking about all these Adventists and Millerites who were running for office, I wanted to stand up and cheer. Because the fact of the matter is that's what's required. If your voice is not in the square, guess what? The square goes on without you. And it's so critical that our voice be there. There's a correct way to engage in the business that we do, but sometimes we start combining it in a way where you see these type of things that you think that your political people can actually be your savior. The fact of the matter is there's only one true God. And there is no politician, I don't care who they are, that can be the person that can determine whether or not you're going to one day see God. Do whatever you want to do in life, but trust me, there's no politician that can take you closer to heaven. Joe Biden doesn't get me close to Jesus. Donald Trump doesn't get me close to Jesus. Chuck Schumer won't get me close to Jesus. Only I can get myself close to Jesus. And bringing that to church to get involved in anything is something that I believe that God does not want us to do. Practical aspects, when something comes on in your church and a brother or sister says something that offends you, please practice humbling yourself and focus on the passion of Christ. Do not allow what somebody says in church to determine whether or not you can keep going to church. Do not allow yourself to be in a position where the politics of an individual can get in the way of things. Don't let political action replace biblical command. God has called on us to love all of our fellow men, and I'm going to put another cast of shadow on your Sabbath. He told you got to love your enemies too. And guess what loving your enemy means? You got to be nice to them. This is what God has required of us. You know, I wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that we had been doing as it relates to public affairs. I wanted you to kind of understand from our perspective how we've been trying to go out and speak to our constituents and individuals who are in our churches. But I'm here to tell you that this might be one of the most exciting work that you can do. We're starting to get young people involved in the idea of public affairs and religious liberty. We have a number of interns that work with us that are at Washington Adventist University. They're a part of all of our programs. They assist us in doing what's going on. You know, young people love action. And if they know that action is taking place, they're in both feet. What kind of action is better than going out and fighting political fights, making sure that you're standing up for your church? When they find out that we go out and fight on behalf of individuals who are not even Seventh-day Adventists, we talk about representing a young lady who's Muslim. We talk about going out and fighting the fight for everyone. That's what they love. You know, one of the funny things when I was working on the Obama campaign, and I remember one day I came to a meeting. And you'll like this, Ed. I walked in and we all sat down to eat. And one of the guys tapped me and he said, Orlan, the stuff you eat is on page 3. Stuff I eat is on page 3. I actually got a little offended. Well, what was he talking about? But you know what I realized? They had been watching me. They saw that there were certain things I didn't eat and certain things I didn't drink. I didn't make any statements about it. I didn't even point it out. But people are watching you all the time. So what you have to do is to be willing to be a representative of God at all times. Can you imagine if one day I came to the meeting and I ordered smothered pork and 2 beers? All my credibility goes out the window. God will protect you no matter where you are. And you know why it's even more important? Because they already know who you are. You can't hide. We saw in the Bible, poor Peter couldn't even cuss right. The moment he started cussing, they knew who he was. You may as well be what God has for you to be because he's there to protect you and they already know who you are. You know, I put a QR code on there. This actually takes you to our show called Faith and Politics, and we try to put out something every week. So, you know, we've got some interesting issues that we talk about. This week, we're talking about the global situation as it relates to religious freedom. We had a show the other week that blew up because it was a show where there was an individual who had sued their church for tithe money, saying that it was fraudulent tithe usage of the money, and they wanted 7 years of tithe coming back, and they went to court, and guess what? They won at the first level. So obviously the Adventist Church is now writing a brief because we do not want to see that continue to happen in any way, and so many other churches as well. But this is what's going on out there. And we are trying to inform members and let them know that if you come aboard, we can find exciting things to work on. So I hope this information was helpful. I hope it gave you guys a little bit of flavor of what we like to do. If there are any questions, we'd love to take them. We work a lot with our parl directors in the area. Jennifer is actually one of our great parl directors. We really hated losing her. I had dinner with her mother today, and I didn't even know that was your mother, Jennifer. So we were sitting there talking for a long time. And I only said 2 bad things about you before she told me that she was your mother. But we have a great team of individuals is really what we have. And I just enjoy doing the work and just hope that we can be of support and hopefully a great representation for you as well. Any questions? Brother Burton.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. So I'm curious to know, we hear a lot about religious liberty when it comes to Parle, but I have heard some inklings that Parle involves itself in some other sort of civil liberties as well. I don't know how much though. Like, are we engaged much when it comes to civil liberties, or is it really mostly religious liberty? I'd love to know more.
Well, to be honest, a lot of your religious liberty is kind of wrapped up in your own personal conscious belief. So, for example, when the vaccine issues were going on, that was one of the main battles that we were having. The way the law is actually crafted is that really the moment that you make clear that you have a quote-unquote religious quote-unquote issue, then now it's not a matter of whether you're a Seventh-day Adventist or this or that. What it really becomes at that point is whatever your fundamental religious belief is, we want to be able to come in and support it. And so when you start talking about, your conscientious points of view, one of the things that we want to make sure that all of our members know that whatever that may be, we are there for you. It's not about whether or not we believe, for example, in vaccines or not believe in vaccines. It's more, what do you believe in? And based on what you believe in, this is important. And this is a critical point, because the last thing we ever want to see happening is some judge determining whether or not you are religious enough. I mean, what happens if you were not Adventist last week and now you're Adventist this week, and someone wants to judge you to say, well, that's not what you were last week? Well, no, that's not how this works. Where I am is where I am, and I'm not here to judge you, and I don't want anybody else judging you as well. So that's more of the kind of work that we get in. And one of the things that we did, especially during the vaccine time frame, is we assisted people in crafting letters in their own name where they were, quote unquote, fighting these fights for themselves. And the reason that was so important is because we have fought so much that the law should not have to require you to demonstrate that you are, quote unquote, part of a specific religion in order for it to apply. Because if that's what ends up happening, and most of these laws, many people don't realize, benefit smaller groups like ours. Because can you imagine if you come back with a letter and says, well, I'm a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and somebody says, well, there's only 1 million of you guys in the United States. That's not a real religion. That's more of a cult. That's more of this. So we have to have it set up in a way so that we can protect all people. I don't know if you guys heard this. Last week, there were 6 prisoners in New York that decided that they were going to sue the state because they weren't going to be allowed to watch the eclipse. And they said that watching the eclipse was part of their religious beliefs. And as a result thereof, it's in court right now whether or not that should take place or not. Now, on one hand, I might chuckle. But on the other hand, if somebody says, Orlan, you guys going to be out there swinging for them? Swinging away is what we're going to be doing, because you never know when you're going to need somebody to swing for you who happens to be in a church with a woman who got hit with a rock in the head, right? So these are the ways we have to look at things. Melissa.
I was just going to add to that story. So one of the 6 individuals is a Seventh-day Adventist, and in fact, their religious freedom was granted. They will be able to see the eclipse.
My sister.
I really thank you so much for both your talks and for the presentations that you've done. I appreciate the work that you do. There has been, and I appreciate that you've mentioned a couple of times these varying definitions and how the term, the concept of religious liberty is being variously employed. Can you provide just how is your office understanding defining this notion of religious liberty?
Yeah, I mean, religious liberty is really the protection of anybody's quote unquote personal beliefs that they have from a religious perspective. So it's not so what I would call in a box that if you are connected with this or connected with that, that makes it quote unquote reliable or tangible or substantial in any way. What we end up doing is we really have to basically follow behind what's important to you. Now, what's important to you may not be important to anybody else. And people will say, well, Orlan, that doesn't make any sense. If we're all Seventh-day Adventists, we should all pretty much kind of believe the same thing. If I polled everybody in here right now and asked you exactly how you kept the Sabbath every Sabbath, I bet you I'd get a few different things. Just a few. But the point is that how you decide to keep your Sabbath in conjunction with you and your God is your personal conscientious belief.
If I can follow up,
Sure.
how does that fit within the context, the current policy context and legal context of precedent for registry?
Well, the way the law is really crafted, whatever you actually believe from a quote unquote religious perspective for you, that's what is covered. So the idea is not that you are part of what we would call an established or understood or legitimate quote unquote reasoning. I mean, we just talked about these individuals with the eclipse, and there's a guy who's a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't ever remember reading about the eclipse as it relates to anything that has to do with our doctrine, but somebody actually probably came to the conclusion, you know what? If that's what that person really believes, what's the downside of allowing it to move forward? Because the last thing I really want to see is judges making that decision. So what you claim you are, when you come to us, we accept what you tell us because we don't believe that we're in a position to actually judge. And there's some very strange things out there that have been protected. And there's going to be even more strange things that are out there that are going to be protected. And the reason I think that's so important, as I mentioned, there are a lot of people who think that what we do is very strange. And so, we have to make sure that we're not really casting aspersions on people. Do we look at things and we want to chuckle and laugh? And, you got prisoners who, want to be part of a religious group that they want to wear a patch and a hook because they believe they're a pirate and they only want to eat spaghetti. But then you got a prisoner who tells you I must eat Chateaubriand 3 times a week or else that's, I don't know where you draw the line on some of this stuff, but it starts to get so out there, but you want to err on the side of belief, in my opinion, than on the other side. But it's so important that we be careful with this because once you start to lose credibility, there is a side of our society that says, see, this is now becoming a joke and they're now going too far. And they're being in a position where they shouldn't be allowed to do what they want to do.
Well, can I add to that just a little bit
Sure.
too? And speak to, I think something that is, I was talking a little bit in my talk about how we sort of have a unique perspective as far as what religious freedom looks like, particularly from our Christian brothers and sisters in the work that we, in our understanding. And I think what Orlan is describing as far as recognizing not only are my rights sacred, yours are too. Do you know what I mean? And I think unfortunately that is a minority perspective, where my rights end, yours begin, and vice versa. There is no prioritization there. And so we may be standing up for beliefs or activities or things like that that we're not comfortable with, that are inconsistent, but we recognize your own individual conscience as well. And I think that unfortunately that is not the case for a lot of the common religious, does that make sense to you?
In fact, I think that's actually, I think that's really what I'm teasing out.
Yeah.
Of course, there's some famous subtext to where the idea of religious liberty has been used to infringe on the rights of other people.
Exactly.
And so that is, I think that's...
Yeah, and I think, and Dr. Burton kind of mentioned this point earlier, that when you start talking about getting these exemptions and protections for religious reasons, you are literally getting a license to discriminate. And so when you get a license to discriminate, you now have to tread very slowly in how you're doing that because they're not giving you this in order to discriminate. They're giving you this power in order to protect yourself. But if at some point they start to believe that you're using this more for discrimination, then we may start to see some other things start to push back. There's so many nuances that are engaged when you get into, this idea of how do you protect yourself from a religious standpoint. I'll give you another perfect example. So for example, I have a church in Washington, D.C. And in D.C., we have a number of families in our community that have homeschools. So what our church decided to do is we wanted to make our basement available for homeschool kids in the neighborhood to get together and interact with other children. That gets a little bit tricky because you're supposed to be using your building for things that actually have specific things to do with quote unquote proselytizing or moving forward your religion. You can make the argument that if you are using your building for something other than that you maybe have converted it into a public space. And if you have put it into a public space, then maybe anybody now who wants to use your basement should have the power to do so. These are the little nuances that you have to always be kind of sensitive to. Now, mind you, I think there is a way that you can make the argument that doing this on this family and this is part of what's going on, but I can also see how the arguments could be made the other way. And most people just need to get into court, because once you get into court, it's now a crapshoot. Nothing is determined and automatic. And so that's part of the issues in trying to protect ourselves from that standpoint. Brother Denslow.
Yeah, well, you may want to speak a little bit about the process of picking up these cases. Not every case that comes through gets accepted, partially because of resourcing, but also some cases are not, and in the vetting don't prove to be worthy. But there is a process, and that might be helpful.
Yeah, there's a process that we go through at the North American division that actually, when something comes usually from the union, so something that's actually happening at the church level first starts off at the church, where you have a pastor that probably, if it's a Sabbath accommodation, would be someone who would write a letter on your behalf and try to make sure that you could be in a position where you could be accommodated. Usually if that doesn't work, then you'll find it moving up to the conference office. The conference office at that point may not be able to handle it, so it'll move up to the union. The union will go out and try to do what it can do to also get the process in place, but sometimes the union may come to the NAD and say, you know what, we need your assistance on this. So then we have a committee at the NAD in which we take a look at different cases that come up to us to come to a conclusion of, one, is this a case that we want to get involved in because the decision is actually something that could make sense and be very helpful for us in the future? Or is this something, well, you know, maybe this doesn't have the right fact pattern that works for us, or some of the facts are a little bit, you know, not skewed in a way that doesn't make sense. And then sometimes even when you get the victory, sometimes it's a little bit, you know, squishy. And I'll give you a perfect example. We had a Supreme Court case that happened not too long ago. You probably heard about it, where we had the mail carrier who was working on Sunday because of the agreement that the post office had with Amazon. And he basically said, listen, Sunday is my day of worship. It is my Sabbath, and I want it off. Case ends up going to court. Unanimous decision by the Supreme Court to say that you should be able to have your day of worship. Great applause, right? But I also now have a huge case that talks about Sunday being the Sabbath. So on one hand, I got a loud clap that we get a chance to know that we're supposed to be protected, but I got to have a quiet clap because I don't want people thinking that Sunday is actually the day of worship from my perspective. But now you got a Supreme Court case, and all these cases that come up regarding this are called Sabbatarian cases. It doesn't matter what the day is. It's a Sabbatarian case. So we have a Sabbatarian case that was ruled on at Supreme Court, unanimous decision, but talks about Sunday being that day. So on one hand, like I said, loud clap, love the decision, quiet cap, wrong day. So you find yourself in these little kind of awkward moments where, you know, as I told somebody, sometimes we don't even know what team to cheer for. It can be so confusing. But at the end of the day, we're just hoping that we're hopefully doing what God would have us to do, and hopefully using these same opinions that would help us when our parishioners are in need. But it's not always this perfect, ideal situation. And there are a lot of cases, even at the North American division, that we don't get a chance to take. We get involved in a lot of cases. Sometimes we have to recommend them to go to other people. We have limited resources, obviously, so we can't just take everything that comes in. But we try to engage in those type of matters that we hope can make a big difference. And I think in the long run, we've done a pretty good job. And hopefully we'll continue to keep doing the work and protecting our people and our churches and others as well. Any other questions? Well, thank you very, very much. This has been a joy. And hopefully if anything comes up where you need us, please reach out to our division. We are always there to be hopefully helpful. And thank you very much for today.